welcome to NAPOD, where we provide NA speaker meetings and workshops in a podcast. We are an ad-free podcast, and if you enjoy listening, please help us to be self-supporting by visiting napod.xyz, look for the donate link, and drop $1 or $2 in the virtual basket. If you're also in AA or have friends that are, please tell them about our other podcast, Sobercast. Sobercast features AA speakers and workshops in the same format as NAPOD. We upload a new speaker every day, and it's easy to subscribe by searching for Sobercast, that's 2 words, on any podcast player app, or go to Sobercast.com. Enjoy the podcast, and thanks for listening.
Hi, my name's Greg.
My name is Bob, and I'm an addict.
And we got to toying with the idea of this workshop a little bit. And we're going to try to do something a little different than the way workshops have been historically done. What we decided to do was to go through this and interview each other. We're separating the history of NA into 4 basic sections. First of all is the beginnings. And Bob's going to ask me questions about what I know about that. Bob came to the program in the late 50s and finally stuck in the early 60s. So I'm going to ask him questions about that time frame. 1959 through the early 70s. I came around the program in 1970, so Bob's going to ask me questions about the time that I was real involved in the 70s. And then we're going to go back and forth, and then we'll end up talking about the time from 1988 to the present, or the mid-80s to the present, and then we're going to go into a question and answer session with you guys. That's how we're going to try to do it. We want to try to keep this within the time frame given, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on things. We can't afford to do that. We got to move real quickly. I know I have a bad habit when I'm talking about the history of wanting to do a 3 or 4 hour workshop, and we don't have time to do that. There is a lot to be shared. So I'm going to turn this over to Bob, who's going to interview me about the birth of NA.
As I said, my name is Bob, and I'm an addict. I would say usually it's the kind of things that we try to do and cover some bases. And one of the things about the history of Narcotics Anonymous is very complex because we're people that didn't keep records. We didn't like to write things down. We don't want to be known as to we stopped anywhere, you know. So, but we leave a trail. We leave a trail. We seem to, you know, invariably we'll leave a trail of paper somewhere along the way where we've been. You know, they've written us up, or they've arrested us, or we become an item in a newspaper, or whatever the case may be. And in some cases like this here, is Greg was talking about, he's good in terms of researching and looking up data. He's one of these people that got one of these heads that like to know all the answers, in a sense of speaking, so he'll start digging for things. So I think one of the reasons we're going to do this interview thing in the beginning is I'm talking about the period of time before Narcotics Anonymous as we know it today, because the Narcotics Anonymous as we know it today comes from a different place from the narcotics of yesteryear. The legacy was not left in terms of what recovery was about. It was started very early, and I think this is one of the periods we've come to find out that we've looked through papers, we looked through archives, and we come up with a lot of beginnings. And part of the deterioration of those beginnings, you wonder what happened to it, and that's what we're going to talk about. And I think Greg has some information as to those early beginnings prior to 1950. So what was happening around the country as far as Narcotics Anonymous before the 1950s?
Okay, when I came around, one of the things I was exposed to was an idea that there was stuff around before NA. In fact, in the 20th anniversary talk, there's There was a statement made that said before NA there was HFD, and then later on there was Addicts Anonymous. In the same talk, they mentioned Addicts Anonymous. And I always wondered about those. At the First World Convention, Bob gave a copy of the bylaws of the 1953 starting that we read about in the basic text to Jimmy. And in those papers and in those starting minutes, there was a line that says, our purpose was taken for the key. And I can remember asking Bob in the 70s, what's the key? And Bob said, well, it was this thing that used to float around. And that's all we knew. At least that's all I knew. And I'm real curious about that. Some years back, I received a copy of an article entitled These Drug Addicts Cure One Another. It's from the Saturday Evening Post, August 7th, 1954. And it tells the story of a Narcotics Anonymous that's very different than the one you and I know. The basic story goes, and by the way, since then, more and more and more and more documentation has shown up about a Narcotics Anonymous prior and other 12-step fellowships for addicts prior to NA as we know it. I have a list of references here. New York Times, June 10th, 1950. Chicago Sun-Times, August 17th, 1950. Time Magazine, May 7th, 51. The Courier Journal, Lexington Bureau, July 8th, 1951. Here's the U.S. Journal of Public Health, 1951. The Newsweek, September 17th, 1951. Family Circle, October 1951. The Christian Evangelist, October 17th, 1951. U.S. Public Health Service Public Affairs pamphlet, September 52. The Saturday Evening Post article. And I'm saying all these, so if you get a copy of the tape, maybe you can try to find some of these for yourself and look them up. New York Post, January 10th, 1958. There was a series of over a couple of weeks. I've found copies of January 10th, January 14th, January 19th, all 1958. There was a copy of a handbook for patients at the U.S. Public Health Service Hospital in Lexington, Kentucky. There was an article called From Crisis to Crisis in the Salvation Army publication. There are a bunch of things that have surfaced about this other NA, and it's pretty well documented at this point. The story goes, and I'm not going to read all of it, in the mid-40s, a man by the name of Houston S. Got involved in Alcoholics Anonymous in Montgomery, Alabama. And he, just like most of us, jumped in with all 3 feet and got overly involved and started doing 12-step work and helping people and carrying the message, and just, he fell in love. And one of the people he talked to was an alcoholic who was also a morphine addict. And just like experience has proven 10,000, 20, 30,000 times since, the guy went to AA and he stopped drinking, but he kept using the morphine. And this just drove Houston crazy, because he figured the guy ought to be able to clean up. Remember, we're talking about the mid-40s. We're talking about a very, very different time period. We're talking about a period where there is no disease concept, where alcoholic addiction and barbiturate addiction and heroin addiction and all these different types of addictions are not even recognized as diseases. They're primarily thought of as moral problems. And if a person would just act right, they'd be okay. He moved with his business to Frankfort, Kentucky. and he approached Dr. V.H. Vogel, who was then the medical officer in charge at the Lexington U.S. Public Health Service Hospital, Lexington, Kentucky. That program for addicts started in the mid-30s. That and the Narcotics Farm in Fort Worth, Texas. And Houston proposed that they start a 12-step meeting like Alcoholics Anonymous, but for the addicts in the U.S. Public Health Service Hospital, a voluntary meeting. And they called it Addicts Anonymous. And that meeting ran from February of 1947, when they had their first meeting, probably continuously until sometime, and I don't remember the exact date, in the 70s when they closed the U.S. Public Health Service Hospital. So it ran for a long time. It ran for 20, 25 years. Out of that grew a lot of things. It was real different than what we think of as NA. There were no traditions. It was institution-based. It was real different than what you and I think of as NA. In this same article, there's a line that says that they published a newsletter called The Key. And I went, aha! So that's what the key was. So in our founding minutes, the founding minutes of NA as we know it, there's a line that says our purpose was taken from the key. And there's a statement of purpose that's published with those minutes. I found a copy of the key in the Federal Archives in Atlanta, Georgia. And since then, 2 more copies have surfaced. This is from a little later time period. This is from the early 60s. But it's still a copy of the key. And lo and behold, there's something called Our Purpose, which is virtually identical to the notice we sent out to announce the meeting that most of us think of as the beginnings of Narcotics Anonymous. And so that's a connection. Recently, some notes of Jimmy's have surfaced that indicate that he had contact with a Dan C. in 1952. Dan C. was one of the patients at the U.S. Public Health Service Hospital. He got out in 1948. He hooked up with a Major Dorothy Berry, and they started meetings in the Women's House of Detention and in the New York prison system called Narcotics Anonymous in 1948. He relapsed and went back to Lexington in 1948 or 49. He got out late in 49, and early in 1950, he came and started Narcotics Anonymous at the YMCA in New York City. And there was a group, open to the public group, called Narcotics Anonymous in New York City in 1950. Okay. Some other things grew out of that. And that's probably where we get our name from, is from that group. The idea of using the 12 steps for addicts probably comes from Houston S. It was in a time period where people were experimenting, applying this new way of life to other problems. And all kinds of people were applying the 12 steps to all kinds of different things. The idea of a fellowship for addicts or meetings just for addicts probably comes from the U.S. Public Health Service Hospital in Lexington. The name probably comes from New York. The spirit of Narcotics Anonymous, the change in the steps that is so dear to you and I, changing from substance to disease, clearly comes from the attempt in 1953 that we chart as our beginnings. Okay, out of Lexington, quickly it went to Fort Worth. They had Addicts Anonymous meetings. One of the people that got out of Lexington started meetings in the federal penitentiary in Lorton, Virginia. One of the folks that got out of Lexington came to California and started the habit-forming drug groups. This was a woman by the name of Betty Fong. There's a letter that she got from Bill Wilson in 1954 that is a kick, and I'll read it, but it tells you something about what was happening at that point. And I do have a copy of it right here. Okay. Dear Betty, thanks a million, nay, 2 million, for your heartwarming letter of March 11th, updating me on the progress on your progress with addicts. I think this is all perfectly wonderful. At this stage, I'm sure it's the quality that counts rather than quantity. That you have been doing a quality job and have inspired others to do likewise is evident. Can you tell me of the progress of those other groups which at Lexington and here in the East go under the name Addicts Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous? At times I pick up very second-hand stories to the effect that they are making progress, but not so much as they might if they really came to grips with the 12 steps and had proper hospitalization. I'm also interested to know how many people you feel you have really straightened up, and how these divide themselves by narcotics who were once alcoholics and the narcotic pure and simple. All of you concerned with this work surely have my warmest appreciation, and I hope you'll let everyone know, you will let everyone have the occasion of knowing it. Meanwhile, the main transmission bill to the addict will be from our AA members who have also suffered addiction, and they should surely be allowed attendance at open AA meetings just as everyone else is. One more question. Do any of your recoveries who were straight addiction cases find difficulty in identifying themselves with other AA members? I guess I told you I've noticed in many alcoholics a marked aversion to dope addicts. And vice versa. How is this situation working out as you now see it? I wish I could write you the long letter that yours deserves, but my desk is piled high. Meanwhile, may God love you dearly, all of you, devotedly, Bill Wilson. And that speaks of a small fellowship in California. Also in California, there were Addicts Anonymous groups started by someone else who came out of Lexington. Not too long ago, a document surfaced. There's a book called The Narcotics Menace that was published in Los Angeles in 1952. On page 158, it says, and they're talking about a meeting that was held to discuss how to deal with kids using drugs. Attending the meeting were two members of the Los Angeles group of NA, Narcotics Anonymous, also known as AA, Addicts Anonymous, an organization founded at the Narcotics Hospital at Lexington, Kentucky. So there was a Narcotics Anonymous in Southern California in 1952 or before. There's a reference to that same Narcotics Anonymous in this Drug Addicts Who Cure Each Other article. They also had one in Vancouver, British Columbia. They list 4 sites for these types of meetings. I think one of the things to help understand these meetings is that they were more like groups, and the names were more like group names as we understand them than they were about fellowships per se. And what we had was a set of groups started by individuals, most of whom came out of Lexington Hospital, loosely affiliated. They were contacted and kept in touch by the newsletter The Key and through personal contact. And they were spreading a lot of places. There were meetings that developed in New Jersey. There were meetings that developed in Ohio. There were meetings that developed all over the place. The group took an AA pamphlet called The AA Way of Life, plagiarized it and published it, and used it as their basic literature. I will read you part of that just for comparison's sake. Now, we read from the readings today, and a little further on, we'll read a little bit from the first literature that was published in Southern California. Membership of NA groups. Membership of our groups consists entirely of former addicts whose self-administration of addicting drugs has brought us to disaster. We learn from experience that after withdrawal, any further indulgence constitutes a totally unacceptable and hopeless way of life. We are completely sincere in our desire to stay free of addicting drugs for once and for all. We recognize that the uses of narcotics or sedatives is a real problem for us, not merely a problem of dissipation, but a reaction to a dangerous and progressive illness. We clearly understand that once we have been addicted, we can never again learn to control the use of drugs. We will forever remain sensitive to drugs and will never again be able to take them We must learn to accept that fact if we are to conquer addiction, and so on and so forth. None of that sounds familiar to you. None of it sounds familiar to me. That's not what I heard when I came to meetings. The material in the first NA publication will sound reminiscent to you. Let me read parts of that. This was written in 1956, 55, 56, in the attempt that we look at. What is the Narcotics Anonymous program? Narcotics Anonymous is an absolutely non-profit-making fellowship and is connected with no police, political, or religious organizations. There are no initiation fees, no dues, no charges of any kind. There are no pledges to sign. Anyone may join regardless of age, race, color, or religion. We're not interested in what you used, how much, or who your connections were. All that we ask is that you have a sincere, honest desire to stop using. We of Narcotics Anonymous are exactly like you. We are a group of addicts who meet regularly to help each other to obtain and maintain our sobriety and to stay clean. Before coming to on the program, our trouble was that we could not manage our own lives. We couldn't live like normal people. We had to have something, and we thought we'd found it in drugs and narcotics. We had to have these drugs and narcotics no matter the cost. We placed their use ahead of the welfare of our families, wives, and children. We did them great harm, but most of all, we harmed ourselves. We broke not only the laws of society, but the greatest law of all, the law of nature. And it goes on, and it lists the steps almost precisely as we know them, with the we's in the front, and we admitted we were powerless over addiction. That will sound familiar to you. And this is clearly the source material for the NA literature that you and I are familiar with. Okay, we have these groups, and I want to paint a picture of what it must have been like in Southern California about the time people were talking about starting this NA of ours. There were a few groups out there for addicts related to this Lexington, Kentucky. There were three main transmission lines for these groups. One was the federal institutions. There is a member who remembers a group that was held at Terminal Island Penitentiary in the early 50s, and he tells that there were two podiums. One podium had 12 steps on it, and that was for alcoholics, and the other podium had 13 steps on it, and that was for dope fiends. Let me read you the 13 steps of Narcotics Anonymous. If I can find it here. Here we go. Narcotics Anonymous, the 13 steps. This grows out of that Narcotics Anonymous in New York. This was actually published, this typing was actually published in a group in Cleveland that existed in the early 60s. Step 1, admit the use of narcotics made my life seem more tolerable, but the drug had become an undesirable power over my life. 2, came to realize that to face life without drugs, I must develop an inner strength. 3, make a decision to face the suffering of withdrawal. 4, learn to accept my fears without drugs. 5, find someone who has progressed this far who is able to assist me. 6, admit to him the nature and depth of my addiction. 7, realize the seriousness of my shortcomings and as I know them and accept the responsibility of facing them. 8. Admit before a group of NA members these same shortcomings and explain how I'm trying to overcome them. 9. List for my own understanding all the persons I have hurt. 10. Take a daily inventory of my actions and admit to myself those which are contrary to good conscience. 11. Realize that to maintain freedom from drugs, I must share with others the experience from which I've benefited. 12. Determine a process in life and a purpose in life and try with all the spiritual and physical power within me to move towards its fulfillment. 13. God help me. That was happening in Southern California. Also happening in Southern California was the Salvation Army, who had a project called Narcotics Anonymous, who was headed up by a Major Dorothy Berry and later Brigadier Dorothy Berry, which comes from the first time Dan Carlson got out. So we've got the prison system, we've got the Salvation Army, and we also have Alcoholics Anonymous. In Southern California in 1953, there was a group of addicts staying clean in Alcoholics Anonymous. Some were attending these groups. There was certainly knowledge of these groups floating around and copies of the key floating around. In August of 1953, our basic text says June of 1953. July of 1953. In July of 1953, they started talking about forming another 12-step fellowship for addicts. Another one of these many small groups. On August 17th, 1953, they got together formally. A committee of 6, including Gilda Krause, Paul Rosenbluth, Jimmy Kinnan, Steve Ryan, Frank Carnahan, and Doris Carnahan, got together at 10146 Stagg Street at 8 p.m. for the purpose of organizing an AANA group. The name San Fernando Valley Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous has been voted on and accepted. These handwritten minutes chronicle the first meetings that were held to start NA as we know it. They talk about developing some guidelines. They talk about taking our purpose from the tree. They talk about finding a place to meet. They talk about changing the name from San Fernando Valley AANA to Narcotics Anonymous. They also list our purpose, and they have which was the announcement of our first meeting, and they have a list of people who were supposed to have attended the first meeting. Also interesting to note that virtually every one of those first 6 people, by the time these minutes end in December of 1953, had resigned. So it's kind of like it is now. The 50s, we have very, very little documentation about. This NA. Probably the best information we have comes from the history talks that were given at the 20th anniversary and 2 years later at the 23rd anniversary, which was really the 22nd anniversary but was misprinted on the tickets. Right from the beginning there were problems. And I'm looking for something here real quick. Okay, it'll be in here. Bylaws, August 17th, 1953. Article 1, the first thing it says, this society or movement shall be known as Narcotics Anonymous, and the name may be used by any group which follows the 12 steps and 12 traditions of Narcotics Anonymous. That's a radical change. We're talking about a fellowship, a movement, a society. We're not talking about isolated groups. Number 2, we're talking about the traditions, not just the steps. That's a very significant statement. In 1953, we started these groups, and some of the things that were talked about early on is we found out very early and our experiences taught us that we could have no bosses, no big shots in Narcotics Anonymous. People were put in position where they became leaders. People dominated. The fellowship would die out. They would restart. Some of the things that happened in the 50s is our first literature was developed, which I read from. It looked like that. It's right underneath your paper there. Look, here's a copy of our first literature from 1956. Meeting places changed. There were things called rabbit meetings, which would go from house to house to house to house every week, meeting in a different place, and they'd pass on the coffee cups and stuff like that. There were meetings held in sanitariums. There were meetings held all kinds of different places. There was supposed to have been a meeting held at a place called Schreier's Dryer, and I understand once a week they'd count heads. And if there were more alcoholics, they'd have an AA meeting. If there were more addicts, they'd have an NA meeting. A lot of the NA meetings in that time, from what I've been told, happened in coffee shops after AA meetings. I don't find any real continuity in Narcotics Anonymous in the 1950s. People were in and out. I've been told that someone would get excited about NA and pick up a piece of literature, and they'd start a group going for a while. 3 or 4 months later, no one would be coming. The novelty would wear off, and the group would dwindle, and they'd stop having it. 2 or 3 months after that, a newcomer would walk into AA, and they'd get snatched, and someone would start the group back up real quick. and that's kind of what it was like. I really don't find any continuity in the 50s, and there is very, 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 very little documentation. There is a little word of mouth. In 1959, NA died. In the East, the person that had started Narcotics Anonymous, Dan Carlson, died in 1956. That NA died out in the early 60s. NA in California died in 1959. The habit-forming drug groups died. Addicts Anonymous died. Nortrol, the one at Lorton, Virginia, died. The Addicts Anonymous group in Lexington struggled on as long as Lexington was open. When Lexington got shut down, the group died. All these efforts died. Bob came around the fellowship first in 1959, and it was at the tail ends. And from what he's told me, he'd go to a meeting probably once every 2 or 3 months, 4 months in that time period, just to check things out. And I'll let him tell you about what he found, and what he found a couple of years later when he came back to stay in 1962. Bob? 61.
Not only during that early period in which he was talking about did addiction change in many ways because it became so widespread, the laws changed, making it very tough for addicts to even congregate in small groups anywhere. The New York laws changed, the California laws changed, the laws changed across. It's called Get Tough with Drug Addicts. It was called one of the things that said you didn't want even known to be a drug addict or associated around drug addicts, because you might get locked up. It was that simple. And you're talking about a period of time of called getting tough and trying to stay out of the limelight. That was the period of time. And it was that kind of like the height of my addiction, a period of time that I found it extremely difficult in terms of maintaining a habit on the street. And the only reason that I went to Narcotics Anonymous at that time was because my wife insisted. It's usually stated in the book that I found the only meaning in the world. I found it after she presented it to me. Now, where she went to find the Narcotics Anonymous, and they had one meeting in the world, and she go out and find it. You know, I had to send her out to investigate and find out what this thing was all about. And she went over this place over in Sun Valley and talked to this person called Jimmy, and he told her about addicts getting together to help each other to solve their common problem and to stay clean. It sounded like an idea to me in a sense, but I wasn't ready to clean up. I just wanted to keep her off my back, so I decided I would go over there and present me to them, and I could tell them how to get their shit together and continue to do what I was doing, because that's what I was doing anyhow. So, but I went over, and it was kind of a funny thing, that you're talking about the first meetings. You're talking about at Sanitarium at Schreier's Drive, is what it was called. It was a dry out place for alcoholics. But some of these same people that were forming this group in the valley all came out of primarily one clubhouse affiliation, North Hollywood Clubhouse. And that's where it kind of basically, they had quite a few addicts that were coming to those particular meetings. And they were trying to carry the message to the best of their ability to different people in different places. And they went into institutions and such and tried to seek out addicts and to tell them that there was a thing called Narcotics Anonymous, and perhaps we had a meeting, and you come on over to the meeting and we'll see if we can do some help. So this one meeting, you said, I walked in, the doors of Narcotics Anonymous, not impressed. As far as addicts was concerned, it was a period of time you talked about earlier. You say that the hippie era, this was just previous to the hippie era, so everybody, as far as I was concerned, dope fiends were supposed to be hip, slip, and cool. They're supposed to be, to have the right talk, they're supposed to have the right drag, they had the right dress on or the right whatever, and talk the long shit, So I was kind of in a strange land. I walked in the doors of Narcotics Anonymous, and there were 3 or 4 people sitting around the table talking about problem solving. Well, who got a problem today? Hell, Bob always had a problem, shit. Just being there was a problem, And could you get me a job, and could you give me some money? Could you get me a car? Could you get me an new old lady? Just from here on my case, and that's all they would tell me is keep coming back, And half of them I didn't think were dope fiends anyhow, because they did not fit what I thought an addict was supposed to look like, They were run from the wrong ethnic group anyhow, with no black faces in there. There was a couple of browns and a couple of white, and they were kind of all ages imaginable, and half of them were loaded, because that's the way we went to meetings at that time. We'd go to see who was there very often, and our problem wasn't alcohol, so, it knocked me off a short dog before I got there, because I didn't have a problem with that, And then I could get my mouth to get to flying. Who want to say, Bob? Bob, we'll talk, And I found out that's one of the things about addicts. Addicts love to talk, They're not talking about anything, but they love to talk, But they would read the steps, and they would talk about these here things called these steps applied to self and recovery. And it didn't make sense to me, as Beaver was talking about. I could not imagine 12 steps of anything going to help me with my problem, whether they're going to get the parole officer off my back, whether they're going to give me some money, whether they're going to fix this or fix that. And they seemed to be so vague, in terms of what my problem was. My problem. It did not seem to fit my problem, And I used to read the steps and didn't understand the steps. And I thought I could read, but I didn't understand. I had no comprehension as to the extent of what the steps really meant. And just what Beaver was talking about, I had to learn how to use the dictionary. Not then. It was much later. Okay? But I think one of the things that happen in meetings like this is we get caught up in the moment in terms of recovery as possible, and that just maybe something can happen. So I used to, every time I'd go to jail, get out of jail, or whatever the case is, I'd go back to see who was still there. And it became a kind of a repetition of doing that over a period of time. And I think one of the things that was happening during that time is say that there was a certain amount of stabilization was going on in the late 50s and early 60s. There were some people that were getting out of places that had heard about this thing called narcotics now. One more woman in particular, we call her Little Sylvia. I think she's dead now, Little Sylvia Wexler. She came out of Lexington, And she was come out, she was hot and, get things going. She was spearheading things. Let's get them out. Let's get this word out on the street, that recovery is possible. And so she used to, pick up people and take them to meetings and go pull a 12-step call, and we collectively get together and go on 12-step call. We take everybody in the program and go on one 12-step call. Because you have to realize it's a very touchy area in terms of recovery or drugs of any kind, being associated with drugs of any kind. So it seemed to be very difficult in terms of getting an idea that help was available. Because if you were like me, I want to be very specific as to what help I was going to accept. I wanted silk sheet acceptance, And from where I came from, how grandiose our head tells us that what it's supposed to be like, And that's not what it was like. So I bounced around, in and out of Narcotics Anonymous in terms of coming to meetings. I was never really entrenched into it until this thing gets to the progression where you will accept what is offered. And I wore it out. I wore the old lady out, and it got to the place where my disease had reached a proportion that it was already terminal. I just didn't recognize it. And it was coming closer to the things that they had told me in some of those meetings that you carry away from the meetings. You don't intend to carry this information in your head. Okay? Because you got to use it. Once you take possession of it, you don't have that excuse anymore. And I had possession of this information. And I used to carry this book around, and I used to read the steps, right? Not that I understood what it was reading, but somewhere along the line, something kind of filters in, and it stays with you. And you get desperate. And one of the things you're talking about, the rabbit meetings, one of the cases where if you were at the meeting at the beginning of the meeting, if you had the previous meeting, you knew where the next meeting was supposed to be. That's if that addict was still clean to have the meeting. And even when I wasn't clean, I had a meeting at my house, and because I just happened to have a house because I had a wife that had a house. And we had the meeting there, and I was not there. The meeting went on without me, because I was out trying to get some coffee cream and what else. When I got back, the meeting was over. And I could give you all them stories, them long stories that addicts tell. Like I got run over, or a truck hit me, and lost the money, and whatever the case was. The big lie, as usual. But and what happened was, in 1961, I had owed the state some time, so I had to go do some time, and kind of like something happened in that slowdown, and I come to find out the steps will work anywhere. The steps will work while you're locked down just as well as you do anywhere else. And I was able to start a meeting in a penitentiary at Tehachapi, and we had once again the AANA meeting. On the podium with a big plaque on it, AANA meeting, right? But I had a little white pamphlet. Jimmy sent me white pamphlets and pamphlets that we started a meeting of our own, and we kind of carried on the idea, and we started finding out that addicts had a different language. Addicts had a different understanding, had a kind of different feel for what addiction was about. They had a certain empathy in terms of understanding what addiction's about. And that takes nothing away from the other people that do not have the addiction of our nature. We kind of talk a different language. We have a kind of a different Vita probably put it very, very aptly. See, those people are people that have had and don't have now. We have never had. Okay? So we have to start from a different place in terms of what recovery is about. Okay? And that's very, very true. I find that very true. I mean, regardless of what successes you think you may have had, and if you go back, you find out that our place for growing is usually very immature. From that small place, we're talking about that little child place, we have to learn how to grow from. And in 1961, I said I had to go do this little bit, and I got very involved at that time inside as much as I was outside. Probably more so, because I had a lot of time to do it. So when I came out, I was ready. I was off. I hit the ground running. I had parole still. And it was a good little thing, a little notch up on the parole thing in a way. But not the parole department didn't believe in. Probation department did not believe in addicts recovering anyhow. They wanted to lock you back up. The first thing they think about that you're running a scam. Because we do that. I knew how to go to penitentiary and do time and get a good, get good chronos and don't get rolled up and carry the shit to the board, say, hey, you're looking good, And the last time I went to board, the joker said, no. He said, you're a good, good convict. That's all that means, Get out of jail, So I could understand. It kind of opens little doors, or little lights go on like, oh, that's what it's all about. I don't know how to live out here. Okay? And so I get on this journey, and I get very involved in Narcotics Anonymous in terms of doing the things that were suggested, to a point, to the best of my ability. And I had very little ability when I came here, because I had very little understanding as to this journey. I thought you just come in here and dance through here, get clean a few days, shit, I got it, baby, shit, And after I had a year or so, I was out evangelizing, and carrying the message, and sprinkling water on people and shit. And thought I had it down, I didn't have a God, but that was okay. You could be my higher power, shit, that's okay. I didn't give a damn who's been higher power, I had no conscience, no God consciousness, and that came about by something that happens here. Something that happens here. There's an awakening that occurs. In this processing, there's an awakening that occurs. But it takes time. It's over a period of years. This takes time. And our growth took time. And one of the things that happened is they say, it seems those certain things happen in a certain manner, which you're kind of thrust into the limelight or the forefront of what's going on. Jimmy got sick, and somebody else had to step in and take over, so to speak. Jimmy was kind of the person that I call him the lamplighter. They kept the light on, When you needed somebody, you could, look over there. Jimmy's sitting there. He's not saying anything. He's probably writing or something, come on in, Sit down and have a cup of coffee, That kind of person, opening the doors, had the pot on, and made sure the door was open. A place for communication. See, the only one had a telephone that was on most of the time. Only person that you could find most of the time. But most of us, if you were very like me, we were very transient. I was living here today and there tomorrow, didn't have a phone, couldn't get a phone, that kind of thing. But when I got clean, it was one of the things is that I had a phone. It's magic how we get a phone. We can get an apartment and pay the rent. Right. And those things become very important. Then we get a car after we get our license. See, I know addicts. Most addicts, hey, I came and said, I got to have a car. I ain't got no license, but I got to have a car. But I know that's the first question I ask. So first, man, I got to get a car. I'm going down to buy a car. And the first thing I ask is, you got your license? Can you buy insurance? As quiet as it's kept, I started to ask the question, who in here is registered to vote? Woo! We doing good. Yeah. How many of y'all got auto insurance? How many don't have auto insurance and drive? So you see how we put things, we prioritize things. We come to understand the nature of how addicts think. We understand ourselves. We come to some understanding, some full understanding. And part of this processing in terms of what our needs are, as you're talking about some guidelines, one of the big things that did happen early was that they had no particular guides. They had people that were figureheads or people that were ad-libbing as to what they should be doing. There was no chronicling as to how this process is supposed to go on. And one of the things that I like about Greg, he was one of the people that like to sit down and write and research and read and all this stuff. And I used to just ad-lib shit, you know how we do, it's off the top, baby, They have no basis for only the reasoning that goes on up here. So I have to realize, there are people that are more in tune with that idea of structure, how the flow is supposed to go, the consistency of those flows is supposed to go, in order that it be consistent all over. The fellowship, in order to function as a fellowship, must have some consistency. We must have some guides to go by, some consistent guides that we go by. We might apply them differently because of whatever the circumstances are, but we have some guides to go by. And that is one of the reasons why, I guess, to say that the traditions become so very important as to the fellowship and the existence and recovery taking place in an atmosphere where these conditions take place. Our growth is different. We're going to have differences of opinion, differences of ideas, which is quite marked through the history of Narcotics Anonymous, because we can't seem to agree initially about anything. Because we all got these diverse ideas that's popping up. We are good people with great ideas, but no substance or no road work, no background to go with it. I got great ideas, but I have no experience. And one of the things I think that was been brought up for somewhat very recently is we are quite unprepared for a lot of the tasks that we undertake. We want to become great editors and writers and money handlers and things. We have no experience. Okay? We have some vague ideas how we think it should be, but we have no experience. And one of the things that come out of these here particular times is we come out with some bylaws, proposed draft for bylaws, a certain purpose, trying to reach a purpose, and how to get there. A sense of direction, a kind of a roadmap. Jimmy was good for sitting down writing things of that nature. He'd like to kind of mind exercise. He'd like to mind exercises in a lot of ways. And one of the things he used to do, is he used to sit down and kind of point out to us that we needed a sense of direction. We need to write the purpose, write the direction, and then follow that direction. And when it needs to be changed, put some device in order for you can change it, if necessary. But you use tried and true things that work consistently over a period of time. So that was one of the things that Jimmy was very good at, As I say, Jimmy got very sick for a while, and it was left up to many of us to, the few of us that were left, to carry on. We got a telephone now. We got a sense of I can write 2 letters together or add 2 cents together. We never had any money for the other side. Addicts don't. They get clean. They don't have no money. I don't know what happened. They buy a lot of shit, but they don't have no money. And it had no difference from then as it is to now. We're talking about poor, but we're going to Paris. Shit. Ask me, I went. I cried like a mother, around here. I can't do it. But they let me have some plastic, you see. And I know how to deficit spending, because that's what we do most. We do that well, deficit spending. The government doing it, eh? That's a good justification, The government doing it. Everybody's doing it. Yeah. Why can't I do it? Because I get drove up a tree when I get behind and the man on my phone telling me where am I paying my bill, But it's part of this growth thing that goes on here. And one of the things that happened during the 60s was we started developing boards and committees and things to carry out certain tasks. Standing committees, like going to institutions, finance committees that knew how to rub 2 cents together and to count and to pay bills and do those particular things. We didn't have to have too much accounting doing that thing. We didn't have no money during the 60s. We didn't have no money. Period. We had a convention on the fly, Our first convention was out of pocket, strictly out of pocket, because we didn't have no money. It's called, you got $25, I got $25, let's put it together and let's go down and do this thing. Yeah. Because we found out there was a need for some, in this growth thing, of coming together in a different way, to take care of some business, to have some fellowship, to bring together people from far places together to show you that it's happening somewhere else. Okay? Not just in your corner of the world. See, because California thought they had the corner on Narcotics Anonymous. Okay? And then we fought with that one. We fought north and south. Okay? See, in 1965, they had a great project. They wanted to put addicts under a microscope and to study addicts. And so the great universities come out with an idea that let's look at some addicts that are having some success. And where they come to get their staff, they came to Narcotics Anonymous. Ill-prepared in many ways, but they had addicts that were clean. They could work with them. So Berkeley set up a program called Ad Center. And addicts from Southern California went to Northern California to staff Ad Center. And that's how the North got their meeting started in Northern California. It's from this Ad Center, they started meetings, they started working with the university, they started helping addicts, they started having like little halfway houses and little groups of people getting together and having this thing called Narcotics Anonymous and applying the steps to recovery. And then we got to arguing about who had the best program. Our program is better than yours, you know. And then we start arguing about if I wrote the plan for the fellowship in Southern California, Northern California immediately disagreed with it. Without even reading it. And there was outgrowth of the thing that came out about that time is say we had to have a conference so we can get Northern California and Southern California and any other meetings outside of the greater Los Angeles or the Southern California area to come together so we could come to some kind of a guide in order to continue to carry the message as a function as an organization. And during this period of time of the conference, it came together and we agreed and disagreed and we had conferences and we had a time coming together of agreeing to do some things together. And the conference was formed. And out of the conference came a service structure. And out of that service structure, it said, became what pretty much is what Narcotics Anonymous is known today. And many of the things that the tree, and Greg was in part of this process of writing, help writing the tree, and Jimmy and a few other people that knew how a table of organizations is supposed to go together and what they're supposed to do, put it on paper. And surprising enough, addicts like we are, after we agreed to disagree, to follow this here plan, then we destroyed the plan. Huh? And we want to make our own. Because Joe just came in the door and didn't agree with it. Okay? And we want a thing of unanimity as all possible. And it's a very funny thing about addicts. What was initially established that was disassembled, 5 years later we go back to this thing what we just started at the beginning. Because addicts like myself, you know, we don't know a good thing when we see it. Yeah? Not until I disassemble it and put it back together. Okay? And find out that's what they said at first. Yeah? So we have gone through this growth process, and it's been a continual growth process in that same time. Our first World Service Office was the outgrowth of the first convention because we knew that we needed more far-reaching device in order to reach the people. As I said, we had nothing to go on. We had no finances. We started the convention. We had, as the outgrowth of the convention, we had approximately $300 to $400 left in our whole treasury. But we rented a place and paid the rent for probably the first, well, they paid part of the rent first year. I happened to be one of the renter, so it was kind of a case they were renting from me, so if you didn't have it this month, okay, I get it next month, you know. But I only could carry that so long, you know. And they used to say I used to carry the World Service Office in the back of my car. I used to deliver the literature to you, you know. You just tell me where you're going to be, I'll deliver it to you, you know. because you couldn't get me on the phone because I had a job. See, I had started working. And you only could catch me X amount of hour, and I went to every meetings on a regular basis. So you couldn't catch me on the phone, or you could have to leave a message, and I would deliver your whatever you needed, or try to get back to you. It was strictly a volunteer service. Now, we were criticized quite heavily about it being that type, because the world did not know that we didn't have any personnel. Yeah. The world didn't know that. They would write us letters and send big orders about literature, and they wanted advice, they wanted direction, they wanted to know what the hell was happening out here in California. Because by all intents and purposes, we were talking about, we had it going on. And we was only setting ourselves up because we was, giving this great advertisement, Narcotics Analysis, come on, wah, 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 and we had no device for carrying the message. Not to the multitudes. People was writing us from distant places. We had correspondence from Australia, people calling from London, people calling from the East Coast, and we could not respond. We didn't have nobody to answer the phones. We had a phone. We had an answering service. We stayed in touch that way as far as local concerned, but we didn't know this here thing was becoming worldwide. The idea was getting to be like, it's possible that addicts can recover. And along with it, we had the great idea, all of us want to write the great novel. Not that we know how to write, but we know how to want to write the great novel. And what happened was, that the idea said the forming of the literature committee was not only outgrowth, we all had the process that we was going to write something. The little white book, the pamphlet here, when we put the stories in, we had a great fight for 3 or 4 years of getting those stories in this book. Because my story, I don't want you to change a word. I don't care if the period is missing, comma is missing, and an and would help it, Don't change my story, And we fought over those things. I mean, we had, we talking about big fights. We talking about, go get your gun, shit. You don't understand. This is the way it is. And so we have these here, internal battles. But as long as we don't run away from it and stay there to resolve and to solve the initial problem, all is going to be well. And that's part of the saying that Jimmy come with, all the ties that bind together are strong and bows that tear us apart, all will be well. If we come in here in unanimity of service and purpose, we can make some headway. We can make a go of this thing called recovery and carrying the message and reaching the addict that still suffer. And this is just during the period of the 70s and the 82. We couldn't write a book. It was impossible for us to write a book by a committee. We proved them wrong, didn't we? We wrote a book by a committee. We had great difficulty because of the fellowship. The ones that weren't not involved in it were upset with the ones that were involved. They didn't realize we didn't have no money and no directions or no know-how to do this thing because it was strictly voluntary expression. We didn't have no money to go to these here far places where the committees were being held, but we went. We had people that used to get on. We had one fellow to get on a bicycle, to remind you, to ride from Nebraska to Florida on a bicycle. Huh? Did he want to write some literature? Huh? He's still clean. He's still clean. And people hoboed, and they hitchhiked, they got to the literature committee. They dedicated themselves to this purpose of, we're going to do it. There are so many outgrowths of many stories that exist in terms of people that were working toward this thing called recovery. Not only their own recovery, but another person coming along, an addict needing help. And at the explosion of that, I think one of the things that happened as a result of our literature or our basic text came the great explosion of Narcotics Anonymous. The message was carried worldwide by this here means of a piece of literature. Regardless how imperfect it was, for letter and verse, it carried the message. it spoke to the addict. It spoke directly in his language. There were some small places in it that needed some alteration. And there was those addicts around that alterated or changed what they wanted to. They were bitching about using everybody else's thing, but they wrote their own book and distributed it under whatever auspices of they're going to give the message to the world. They create their own mess, really, and we're good for that. I understand that. I can create my money. I usually create the mess, and get right in the middle of it. But as a result of that great explosion, we had a source of revenue. We had to hire personnel to do special jobs. But these are all new beginnings, new areas of expertise that we had very little expertise in. We had people with some idea or some expertise to some degree in any particular area that was able to do with some help, And about this time, I think you said we had a great outgrowth in terms of more involvement. They seen that this thing called Narcotics Anonymous was growing in leaps and bounds, and everybody wanted to be a part of it. It got to the place of what position are you holding? Are you the chair of what? And during this explosion, I think there are many things happened. We had Board of Trustees, and the Board of Trustees, that's a long story in terms of we, in some ways, reran things. At least you thought we did. And the only reason that we were doing whatever work that needed to be done because there was no one else to do it. It wasn't because we were running anything. We may have made a whole lot of mistakes along the way because we didn't know. It wasn't because we weren't trying. It was because we had a unity of purpose as to what we were trying to do. Most of us collectively of the Board of Trustees were working for one thing. Carrying the message to the addict that was still suffering. By whatever means. And by our faltering and falling in many areas, to say, I can't say there's no fault of anyone. There ain't no particular fault. We just didn't know. But we were becoming experts in terms of working through problems or situations as they occurred. And sometimes we were the last board of resort. And sometimes that was the only time if you got to make a decision now, we can't wait for, say, take it to the fellowship to make a decision or pay a bill today. It don't work that way. But it works conversely up the other way around. They say most of the things that happen in Narcotics Anonymous of great importance come from the fellowship up to and including the World Service Office to take care of. That's the way it works. Sometimes you don't think that's the way it works because you had not become a participant in that particular process. But that's the way it works. It comes from the fellowship. What's your need? Can we meet it? And how do we meet it? And then someone has to carry it out. And that's the time you say Greg was a great instrument. As I say, he's good with papers and he's good with forms and formality and that type of thing, and he's kind of consistent along those lines. He has some understanding of those particular things. Eh? Now, if you bring me a car, I can tear it down and put it back together. But I don't know nothing about that damn, computer and all that other shit. I don't know nothing about that shit. And don't want to in a way, because I think it's going to be too complicated, So I just don't bother myself with that. Just bring me another car over here and a truck over here. I can fit that sucker together, But sometimes I like to think that I know how it's supposed to be done. And this is the point where I think Greg can handle very well in terms of, from that time, the committees and how they worked and how how they worked and functioned and how they put them together and how they function today as a pretty functioning outfit. Greg?
Yeah. Bob was at my first meeting in 1970. And there were probably 20 people in the room out of maybe 200 people attending NA. Maybe 20 meetings. What I found here was, a meeting almost every night of the week. Some people who really cared. A small percentage of the people doing all the work. Maybe 4 or 5. And 2 or 3 in Northern California. And that was the scene for me. And that, we had that first World Convention, and we had a first this, and we had the first that, and there was the first area committee starting in 1973, and everybody was sure that would destroy NA. United we stand, divided we fall. And we had a meeting somewhere in the middle of the state that the group from the Northern California Fellowship and the Southern California Fellowship got together. Now, there had been a lot of, Bob mentioned it, a lot of talk back and forth. It's kind of like, our own little mini Civil War. Mm-hmm. And they were publishing their own literature, and we were publishing our own literature, and everyone was doing their own thing, and there was nothing happening consistently. And in the mid-'70s, there was this meeting, and it was really a crazy meeting. There were about 30 there were about 50 people there from Northern and Southern California, and everybody had a brilliant idea. 50 dope fiends in a room talking about how it should be. It's kind of like trying to go to a meeting with a car full. A movie with a car full, and of course you're going to go to that place where they have 6 movies. And you miss 3 before you end up discussing which one you're going to go to. You know how that goes. And that's kind of what that meeting was like. And for me, that meeting was one of these, oh, God. It was one of those patience my ass, we're going to go out and kill something. And Bob talked about the Board of Trustees in the 70s. And one of the things that typified the Board of Trustees that had this reputation for running things and really wasn't running anything was we all came out of a time when there wasn't anybody else to do it. And if you saw a need, you just did it, and you tried to do it within the traditions the best you could. And if you screwed up, you say, I screwed up, I'm sorry. Let's do it different next time. And that's pretty much the way it was. And that same group of people never had anybody else to look to do things for them. Kind of how like one of the things that just kind of bothers me today is how a lot of times our groups, we've kind of abdicated our primary purpose to treatment centers and helplines. How much of a job are we doing actively attempting to carry the message the addict who still suffers in our groups? Bob just shared about the whole fellowship going out to 12-step one person. It wasn't at all unusual for a group to sponsor an H&I meeting. Mm-hmm. We used to do that all the time. A group would say, okay, we're going to do this H&I meeting, and go in and supply the people for the meeting every week for years and years and years. Groups did service projects. Groups took it upon themselves to fill the needs of Narcotics Anonymous in their communities. And I don't see a lot of that anymore. I wish we could do more of that. I think we've kind of passed the buck in a lot of ways. Groups are depending upon areas to take care of group business. Areas are depending on regions to take care of area business, and regions are depending on world services to take care of regional business. And we just kind of keep passing the buck. Anyway, into this thing, this controversy, we came up with the NA tree. As predictable, within a couple of years, there was the blue service manual, and then the green service manual, and then we took the first half of the green service manual and the second half of the blue service manual, and we made a gray one called Twigs. And the standing joke is we started out with a tree and ended up with twigs. And see, because everybody had a brilliant idea. I've got letters at home in my files that use statements in the NA tree to attack the NA tree. It says on page 43 that you can't do this, but you did this. What the NA tree did for the first time was set up a system by which the fellowship can be self-governing, where representatives of the groups would get together and bring input from all the groups as to what should happen in NA. Also about that same time, we published another piece of literature. Besides the white booklet, we took some things that had been floating around, something called Another Look. Someone wrote something for family members. We took some excerpts here and there, and we ended up with 6 IPs real quick. So there was a lot of controversy over those, too. How dare you do that? Now, there was not here, but in San Diego, somebody had painstakingly taken a copy of the Alcoholics Anonymous book and the 12 and 12 and inserted drugs every place there was alcohol and retyped it by hand, the whole thing. In Northern California, there was a book called This Is N.A. And it was a great pamphlet. It was really good. Out of that came IP number 4, which was called We Made a Decision. Good stuff. AA wrote it. We received this thing, a typed version of that, at the office in the mid-'70s, and what do you think about this? And boy, we thought it was really good. Problem was, it didn't belong to us. And that pamphlet, that pink pamphlet, We Made a Decision, only lasted for a very, very short period of time. But there are things like that happen, and we would get something and we'd tear it down, and that's been our history all along. Somebody would come up with something. Finally, in 1976, we had something called the World Service Conference. It was held at the Ventura Convention. There's a program for it. Oh, this is what the NA tree looked like originally. After the first printing of 200, it shrank. And then it went to the other ones. The first World Service Conference was held in Ventura along with the World Convention in 1976. And it was a gathering of representatives from all the fellowships that we knew about. At that time, there were about where is this? At that time, there were about 200 NA meetings in the world that we knew of. We went through and we took a map of the U.S. and we put a little dot on the map for where every meeting was. There were 83 meetings in California. There were 10 meetings in Arizona. There were 16 meetings in Pennsylvania, 11 meetings in Michigan, 4 in Alaska, 16 meetings in Australia, 5 in Montana, 3 in Oregon, 1 in Nevada. Anyway, that shows where they are. And these seem to divide themselves. So we arbitrarily picked some regions. And we had some divisions that came as representatives from around the U.S. Now, people came to that from various places, and we decided to continue growing. There was a committee established at that First World Convention to edit and rewrite the NA tree, which had just come out. The Second World Convention was held at the Jack Tar Hotel along with the World Convention in 1977. The Second World Service Conference, and no one showed up. There was 1 or 2 trustees that showed up, and no representatives. And obviously that wasn't cutting it, so we canceled that one, and we scheduled it for a time other than the World Convention, because everybody was out partying. You know how that is. And we had what was really the first true World Service Conference in 1978. What that did for the fellowship was to establish some formal lines of communication. There was finally a way for each isolated group to hook in with the rest of Narcotics Anonymous, other than by getting on a phone or writing a letter. There was a way where each group became a definable structural part of a greater whole, just like we as individuals become part of a group. And that's one of the things that contributed to the growth which followed. We had this new little bit of literature. Also in 1977 was the beginning of what are called the literature years, the development of the basic text. Really as early as 1972 and in the late 60s, there was talk in the Board of Trustees about we really need a book like Alcoholics Anonymous. There was a committee in 1972, and we had meetings at that same First World Service office that we taped, step study meetings, in hopes that someday we'd be able to use that material as the basis of a book. There was a letter that went out of that in February of 1972, there was a letter that went out of that new World Service office that requesting input, stories, and writings for people to put together to have a book, and there was nothing that came in. We sent that out everywhere, and of course there was nothing out in Fellowship. There was nothing out here. There weren't a lot of people around. It was very premature. But in 1977, some folks showed up at that World Convention. Oh, and there's a great deal about, you talked about the Northern Southern California. The World Convention started in 1971. The first one was in La Mirada. The second one was in North Hollywood. The third one was in San Jose. The fourth one was in Anaheim or Orange County. The fifth one was in Santa Rosa. The sixth one was in Ventura. The seventh one was in San Francisco. We used to go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And in 1977 in Ventura, we had our meeting to decide where the next convention was going to be, and it was due for Southern California because it had been Northern California, right? Well, the controversy between Northern and Southern California had reached the point in there where these 2 or 3 folks brought this token bid from Houston, Texas.
That was the Jack Tar.
That was at the Jack Tar, yeah. And got the World Convention. And it just blew everybody away. Because everybody was fighting so much, no one would agree on where it was going to be. And there were 3 or 4 different proposals from Southern California, and it went to Houston, Texas, and everybody was pissed. But that's one of the great things that happened, because that became the World Convention Roadshow. And there's a program from the World Convention in Houston, Texas. The fellowship in Houston, Texas barely existed and died after the convention. We killed it. There were 300 people there. More than half of them were from California. The following year it was in Atlanta. And we ended up owing a bunch of money, but it didn't kill the fellowship, and a lot of growth came from that. The year after that, it was held in Wichita, Kansas. And and then from Wichita, it went to Miami. From Miami, it went to Milwaukee. From Milwaukee, it went to New York. From New York, it went to Chicago. From Chicago, it went to Washington, D.C. And in 1976, a World Convention was held in London. 86, sorry. 1986, a World Convention was held in London. And just as the moving of the World Convention outside of California into Texas and Georgia and Kansas and all these other places helped trigger growth in Narcotics Anonymous, so the movement of the World Convention outside of the United States helped trigger growth internationally. The other things that were happening, the literature started happening, and there's, Bob was saying, 100 stories that we don't have time to tell on that. I think one of the things that a lot of people fail to realize, not only did the literature process give us a book, it number two gave us 10 times probably as much communication has been going on between the various fellowships. And number 3, there was a consciousness raising that took place. Our current understanding of the nature of addiction, our current disease concept, the way we now look at a lot of things really grew out of discussions that took place in the development of the basic text. And these were new, exciting ideas. And people would go home with these new, exciting ideas. Gosh, really excited. And then, of course, they'd be rejected by their local community. You're crazy, But a new message started getting carried, and the new message really was that NA is for real. Because where these people were from, there was 1 or 2 little NA groups struggling under the wing of AA. First group started happening outside of California in about 1972, in Miami, in Pennsylvania, here and there. And there was not much happening anywhere. I read you that there were 200 groups about in 1976 when the year before the literature started happening. One group here in this state, 3 over here, 16 in this state. But it grew out of that. And the message of the literature years was, wow, this is dynamic, this is vital, you can be a part of NA is for real. And that contributed to the growth. The book hit the stands and exploded. Meetings popped up everywhere. In 1 year, we went from 1 meeting in a state to over 100 meetings in a state. In 1 year. And we did the same thing to the basic text that we did to the NA tree. 5 editions in 5 years, right? Until we realized that was insane, too. There were groups that, there are stories and tragedies and heartaches that go along with that. We also had a newsletter that never really clicked in 1982 called the NA Way. And it still needs our support. We have never really embraced that the way we should. It's a great newsletter. There's a lot of good things that have happened that we didn't embrace. But through this communication, through the new ideas, and through the structural relationships, the scene was set for the growth we experienced in the 80s. And instead of having 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 meetings in a state, all of a sudden we had 100 meetings in a state. And we had meetings in almost every major community. And we had the beginnings of meetings outside the United States. Since that time, a lot of things have happened. There's been continuing growth. There's also seemed to have been a slowdown in a lot of ways. But I think what has happened is growth has shifted. Where we used to be seeing new fellowships spring up in a place where there was no NA. In the last 5, 6, 7 years, we've been seeing more filling in the gaps. Rural NA has taken a big leap. There are a ton of 20,000 population cities that have 1, 2, or 3 NA meetings a week. 20 miles from another one that has 1, 2, or 3 NA meetings a week. 20 miles from another one, and the map is filling in. And internationally, we're doing the same thing. It's still more dynamic in the major cities internationally, but they're starting to have the little rural things. And one of the great things that's happened in the last 5 years is an area that we always had trouble with. Historically, NA was in the suburbs. Because when everybody got clean, they don't want to live in the inner city anymore. And NA was around these major cities. And NA in the center city has exploded in the last 5 years. And today, our program is embraced by more and more and more and more and more people. And we have the kind of diversity that we only dreamed about. And we have the kind of input from all different kinds of cultures and all different kinds of languages and all different kinds of people that we always dreamed about, which is exciting. NA is still growing dynamically, but it isn't the going from 1 meeting in a state to 100. It's the filling in the blank spots in the map. Some of you here, and one of the neat things about the growth of NA here that I've had the luxury of being in communication with a little bit has been, this is a lot like the dynamics that were happening years ago, and it's exciting. You know, those of you who are involved in the fellowship here in Baja and in other parts of Mexico have a golden opportunity. The members that are here from Southern California have a golden opportunity to be part of this growth too, because the things that are happening here are just like they've happened before, and it's exciting, and it's dynamic, and it's just, it's one of those goosebump type experiences to be able to come and visit a fellowship that's experiencing the things that helped me bet my life on NA. And it's still happening. And it's going to happen down the road. And it's going to happen here, and it's going to happen here, and it's going to happen here, and it's going to happen here. And we can all be a part of that. Unfortunately, we tend to get hooked up in our own stuff and not have time for it. And it's really, somehow I feel sorry for some of the folks that never have experienced some of that stuff. Road trips. I mean, it was nothing to drive 70 miles to a meeting and back. Nothing to go from Los Angeles to San Luis Obispo for the first NA meeting in Central California. 2 carloads of people went up. Turned around that night and came back. No big deal. But we don't seem to be, it seems to be hard to get us out of our communities these days. We get this little rut of meetings. We got so many to choose from. The reason it was nothing to drive 70 miles for a meeting is when you only got 10 to choose from, and they're spread over all of Southern California, you're going to do some driving. But you get different perspectives. And I encourage any of you who have the opportunity to do that, to do it. I used to try to make one meeting a week away from where I live. And I picked different ones every week, and it was a great experience. When I traveled, when I went on vacation, I started planning my vacations around meetings. And as a result, I got to be in Georgia in the 70s before they had 6 meetings, and Kansas and Chicago when there were 2 meetings. And I had been in communication with some of those folks, and you got to go to a meeting and have pizza in Chicago in 1978 when there were like 2 meetings in Chicago. And those kind of experiences are still available today. But you got to look for them just as hard today as you did, back before, 20 years ago. I encourage you to get involved in that stuff. NA is still growing. NA is still dynamic. NA is still happening. We've just skimmed the surface on the stuff here. There is so much going on, and we can be part of it. I think a big part of the message is the pioneer days of NA are still here, if you want them. If you want to be involved in some of this stuff like we've been talking about, go for it. It's exciting. It is dynamic. It's the love affair. You can find out about NA by reading the basic text. You can stay clean by going to meetings, but you can fall in love too.
Let's floor a few meetings off the floor.
So we're going to take questions now. Anything is fair game. Whoa.
Do you have anything, Paula?
Hey, Paula.
There's a book that I know about called The Story of the Basic Text. Will that ever be available to the fellowship?
It's available to the fellowship now, but it don't go through the World Service Office.
Will it ever? Do you think it ever will?
I doubt it. It's one person's opinion, one person's idea, and didn't come through the literature process.
Would you repeat the questions to the tape?
The question was, there is a book that floats around the fellowship in places called The History of the Basic Text. Will that ever be readily available through the World Service Office? And the answer was probably not.
Probably not.
There are other books.
I'll tell you one of the reasons why. It's one person's view or one person's opinion as to how it was done. And it could be more inclusive if it was more inclusive as to the full story. But I think you would have to have greater participation in other people and their stories put into it. So you only have one person's view. And so that's where you get your book from, is from that one person's view.
There are a number of other books that are around the fellowship in a similar fashion. There was a book written in Pennsylvania called, what was
I
it
forgot
called?
the name of it. A couple of them.
Anybody remember what the book was called out of Pennsylvania? No, there's an NA Way of Life book now. There is In Loving Service. What was the book that was written in Pennsylvania in Living Clean?
Living Clean, yeah, that's right.
There have been a number of things written by members and groups in Narcotics Anonymous that are not generally available, but that do float around the fellowship.
Now, if you want to write your book, and submit it to a literature conference or literature committee, and then watch the fair afterwards, then you would understand why they're not in the literature process.
Or even more than that, if you feel something needs to be written, write it.
That's right.
It doesn't matter what becomes of it. Write it and share it with somebody, and you guys will get something from it. Preferably get somebody together with you to help you write it, even if it's, a one-page little deal. Do something, experience that consciousness raising. If nothing else, you will benefit from it. If it ever becomes widely distributed and published, is really kind of irrelevant.
Yes.
Jerry, just an addict.
Hi, Jared.
Hey, Jared.
When was it to this fellowship? I know I've heard takes about Jimmy King and stuff. He used to say, I'm an addict, and when did it come to this fellowship?
An addict and an alcoholic?
Right. Or clean and
Sober?
Right. Okay.
I've heard those before.
Okay, when did the fellowship come to grips with we just identify simply as just an addict? And I think that should be spoken more on, and maybe something should be written about our fellowship as the new breed, like I'm the new breed of Narcotics Analysis sees it.
Okay. To the best of my knowledge, the identification as an addict and an alcoholic started in NA. And it started because a large percentage of the people who came to NA relapsed on alcohol. And we needed a reminder that we couldn't drink either. And remember, there was no clear disease concept at the time. I really think that the clear identification, the identification simply as an addict, other than with a few individuals, grows out of the change in the way we look at our disease, which was described in the basic text.
It was during that same change of the White Book. The language was changed because it was ambiguous in terms of saying alcoholic is addict.
Yeah.
Why are you going to need both?
1985, the White Book changes. The first change in the White Book and the first change in that the material that was written in the 60s came from a group in Cleveland, Ohio. They suggested one word change in the White Booklet, and that change exists in the third edition of the basic text. It was changing the word recovered addict to recovering addict.
Yeah, the lady here.
Hi, I'm Jerry, and I'm an addict.
Hi, Jerry.
Those pamphlets or those newsletters you have up there, is any of that available?
No.
Well,
I'm saying no. It's that usually at a literature gathering or something, if they have a copy machine, sometimes you can get copies.
okay.
That's usually what happens, because it's getting thinner and thinner. Every time we come out here, to an occasion like this here, we go back with a few pages short.
There are periodically people will do some reprints of old stuff. There is some information and some copies of old things that are creeping onto the internet. I suspect before too long, most people who have computer access will be able to download a printed version of an archival type piece.
Cool.
Mm-hmm. You can't do it now much,
But it's around.
but it's coming.
Hi, Jay.
Hi, everybody. Is it true that there's a 6th edition right now in the process of being written of one basic text?
Well, hey, there's probably 6th and 7th both.
When the 5th edition came out, there was a 5-year moratorium put on changes to the basic text. That 5 years is over. It was extended till 98, but there has been some work done various places, and there's a lot of stuff on file input. I don't know of any active formal draft being developed by a recognized literature committee, though.
Yeah. Contact your literature committee and find out what the world. It's not on the priority list, that's for sure. Yes, right here.
I'm an addict, my name's David.
Hey, Dave.
Hey, David.
I'd like to thank you both. Awesome. In those structuring years, when decision-making was transferred from the groups to the area, regional, and world, was the primary purpose lost focus of, and how was that restored? Because we're suffering some of those problems in my area.
Well, I think what happened prior to the service structure being put into place in 1970, beginning of 1976, the majority of the decisions for the Fellowship of Narcotics Anonymous were made by the Board of Trustees. What the service structure did was to provide a vehicle where the fellowship could be self-governing. As we've grown and evolved, a variety of things has happened. Probably the most significant thing that has happened that has affected what you're talking about is we come to our service and we bring our disease with us. And the service structure as it is in place today, in theory, still provides decision-making. Major decisions of the Fellowship of Narcotics Anonymous are still, in theory, made by the Fellowship of Narcotics Anonymous through a representative system. In reality, it hasn't always happened that way, unfortunately. And that's been on us. We have allowed that to take place. If you're concerned about that, don't stand by and watch that continue to take place. Get involved. If you believe in something, stand up for what you believe in. If you believe that, I mean, there is a debate going on between efficiency and reaching as many people as we possibly can, and sticking to group conscience and some of the basics that our fellowship started growing on. We need both efficiency and maintenance of our principles. Finding that balance is something that we haven't done yet, I don't think. We had one back there for a long time. Hi, Dave.
I was wondering how many editions of the first and second basic tests were published, if there's any available, and where you can find them.
There was 2,000 initial copies made.
Red ones and 2,500 of each, was it?
2001, 2,500 other.
Okay.
Greg, please repeat the question so we'll have it on the table.
How many copies of the first and second edition of the basic text are they available? No, they are not readily available except occasionally at auction or used bookstores or Salvation Armies and things like that. The first edition, there were 2,000 reds, 25,000 blue covered, 2,500 blue covered. There was only one printing of the second edition. There were two printings of the second edition. However, the second printing, a large percentage of those had a label stuck in them, changing it.
Mm-hmm.
So there are about, I don't know exactly how many second editions there were. There were more second editions than first editions. But the really massive production didn't start until the third edition revised.
My name's Mark. I'm an addict. What inspired It Works, How, and Why? Could you give me a brief history on it?
It Works, How, and Why. The first thing we received as input to the world, to the basic text, or one of the first things, we in fact received it at that meeting that Bob and I both mentioned in Central California, was a thing called the 12 Steps as practiced by one member. Active work on It Works, How, and Why began almost immediately after the publication of the basic text. It was worked on in Fresno. It was worked on all over the place. A blue-covered 8.5 by 11 document was produced called It Works, How, and Why. It had a shiny cover. You'll see those occasionally. A lot of people really loved it. A lot of people thought it was trash.
What year did it start?
1984, something like there, 85, something like that.
I think I have a copy at home.
One of the things that has happened with literature and other committees, and it seems like every time we change the leadership of the committee, We head off in a different direction. Well, the leadership changed and the world lit. And somebody got the great idea that we need to hire a professional writer to write a Steps and Traditions book. A book was produced. It was half size. It was 5 by 7. It had a white cover, called It Works How and Why. It went out for approval of the fellowship. The fellowship did not approve that. It cost $100,000. Following that fiasco, a decision was made that we were going to try to integrate the two. So a manuscript was published that had a diagonal slash on it. Half was blue and half was white. And it contained the steps from both those two books. Unfortunately, they used the wrong draft of some of the material. So they quickly threw that out and published one with a black half and a white half, which was the second version of the split. And there was also one with yellow and beige on the traditions, with the traditions input. A decision was made at the conference to hold a series of workshops to integrate the two drafts and come up with a rough draft for further work. There was a series of 12 workshops held throughout the United States. I believe there was even one held in Europe and one held in Australia. Each of those came up with a manuscript. In Chicago in 1988-ish, somewhere around the late 80s, there was a conference held to integrate those 12 drafts. The result was something that is called the Chicago draft. The leadership of the Literature Committee changed one more time, and that was never published, other than small amounts. And the process which brought us It Works How and Why today began. The World Lit Committee began working on the steps portion. The conference decided that the Board of Trustees should work on the traditions portion. People were invited in, discussions were held, outlines were written over a series of years. The material was developed, and that's what gave us what we had today. It Works How and Why was extremely expensive in dollars.
And laborious.
And it has been an insane process. Probably a cost of 10 times what it costs to produce the basic text.
Why is it cheaper?
I don't know.
Why?
Maybe not 10 times, but many times. Maybe 6 times as much. I don't know the exact
We
figure.
could not, addicts like as we are, we could not agree upon nothing. That's what the problem was.
But that's the short version. Back at
My name is Rick. I'm an addict.
Rick.
I came in '84. I miss the flavor of Narcotics Anonymous as we had it then. I find a problem that we have now, because I've lived in the city and I've lived in the outlying areas, is that a lot of the people that were there when I came in aren't going to meetings. And they're sitting at home watching Archie Bum. Is Archie still playing? Watching
Somewhere.
and I wonder if this new surge of NA language and properly correct has anything to do with isolating or alienating a lot of our older fellowship. And if not, what the fuck's up?
I see two things that are happening. This many people with that many ideas and direction, you're going to have a division of some kind. And you have some of the old guard. I call them the old guard. There's some of them here. And, I was kind of like wondering how this here history thing was going, because they have a sense of idea as to history. The words, language, their understanding. And it's kind of difficult, they say the person just coming off the street with a new language for them to understand the old language. And so they're kind of stuck. And I think one of the things I had to deal with some of that same issue that you're talking about, because I fought very vigorously about changing language in the white pamphlet. Oh, I had a legion of my own out there, fighting that battle. But once the fellowship, made the change, I was able to make the transition also. Huh? I didn't, keep rocks in my jaws because. No. The fellowship want this here idea, regardless of how I thought it should have been, it wasn't that way. And sometimes I have to think about those same ones you're talking about as to where they are. Because I see them, and I associate with them also. And I see their attitudes, and I see they still got rocks in their jaws. Huh? They need to soften them and put some jelly beans or something else in there and get the rocks out their jaw. The fellowship has spoken. The fellowship is moving. It has changed.
Thank God.
We are, we don't like change. Addicts don't like change. And we get stuck. You say, when the law changed, we don't want to change with the law. Wait a minute, what did they change my law for? I just got this one going and I got to change again, But when you don't change, you're unbending, I'm not growing. Okay? So I had to look at it from another perspective, like, okay, the fellowship, this is what I've put my issue out. The fellowship rejected it, so to speak. They don't know how sharp I was, but they rejected it. And I see that it had worked quite well in the way that you wanted it. So I don't really have a great objection. I just had to move on with it. Yes, back Rick.
Let me address that just a second. There are two things that I see too. One is something that occurred to me, because we've all worried about where our old timers are, right?
Right.
Well, one of the things is there never were that many of us. It's not like there were that many people who were around here prior to 1980. The fellowship was still very small. Another fact is that it's hard to keep recovery your number one priority when staying clean doesn't seem like a problem. There is a natural tendency, as other things start happening in our lives and start to seemingly take precedence and priority, there's a natural backing away that seems to happen with a lot of people. The NA I surrendered to and fell in love with no longer exists. But if I look honestly at the NA in 1970, Bob was at my first meeting. There weren't very many people staying clean. It was only a very, very small percentage of newcomers that stuck. There was a lot of sickness, a lot of negativity, a lot of disease everywhere you looked. Sure, it still seems that way now. But I'm into, I look back longingly at times to those good old days. But I also realize, thank God it ain't like it was. Thank God it's not like it was. Thank God you can go someplace other than Los Angeles or Berkeley and find an NA meeting. Because you couldn't when I come around. If we hadn't changed, we would have died. And if we stop changing now, we're going to dwindle at least.
Yeah, Richard, I'm an addict. You had mentioned earlier some archival NA literature that finds its way to the internet. In my hometown, we have like a recovery bulletin board, and they have the echoes of the different fellowships, and they also have some recovery literature. For example, for AA, they have their big book. They have quite a number of accounts. For NA, when I first logged onto it, they had one package article on Xanax withdrawal, and a scientific journal that someone had uploaded. I explained why that wasn't Narcotics Menace stuff to them, and they withdrew it, and eventually we uploaded a copy of the Southern California Regional Directory. But would you please speak to the issue of NA literature on the internet? Will our basic text ever be scanned and uploaded? And if so, by whom? Does an individual have the right to do that? I understand now there is an NA homepage on the World Wide Web. I haven't looked at it yet. Is that one individual's idea of what the NA homepage should be? Is it an NA literature thing? What is the future of NA literature in that realm?
I really don't know for sure. I know that there are more than one thing happening. Oh, okay. He's asking what the future of NA on the internet is, basically. And I really don't know, okay? I know that there are quite a number of things out there that can be tapped into. I personally haven't evolved that far in my computer skills. And may or may not, who knows? I don't know what the answer is going to be to that. I think that it is very, very likely that that process will continue because there's a real thirst for information. There's a real thirst for historical stuff. There's a real thirst for recovery material. As long as that need is there, common sense says that that need will be met. Now, whether that's met formally by the fellowship as a unified body or by individuals is kind of up to what the fellowship does. If the fellowship does not meet that need, individuals will meet that need.
Yep.
An individual, for example, would scan the basic text and upload it to a recovery bulletin board. Wouldn't that be a violation of a number of things?
I don't see it. It's a public domain issue. I'm not sure if it would or not, because the book is a public book.
The issue you're talking about is an issue that that our society and the world is faced with right now. We don't have the answers for that. I mean, that is an issue worldwide and certainly throughout the United States on all material on the internet. So we ain't going to solve that one or answer that question.
Yes.
My addict name's Ron.
Hey, Ron.
And something that's is confusing me right now is like when you're talking about change, the fellowship is accepted or voted for the concepts. We have our guide to service is the Conversion Guide to Service of Twix, and we've got the guide to service being looked at or
waiting
whatever.
in the wings.
Where are we in that? And what's going to happen? Well, where's the fellowship going with that?
The question is, we've got twigs happening now. There is a guide to service in the wings. Where is the fellowship going with that? To the best of my knowledge, the guide to service document will be resubmitted to the World Service Conference, and then the fellowship will do with it what it wants.
But see the key word, just what he just said. There's no us, them, and so forth. Very often we think there's some magic person out there or thing that's dictating things to you. It's not quite as he said. There's no we and them. It's you. You know, you are them because you become them at any given time. Thing. So don't divorce yourself in terms of saying not taking some responsibilities as to what's happening at any level of service, because you should be an integral part of what's happening at any level of service. Yes, sir.
I'm Tony, I'm an addict. One of the things that really, we're talking about old NA versus new NA and stuff like that, and like the first edition, I'm lucky enough I have the original manuscript, because I was there when you guys were doing it, and we go to the first edition, second edition, third edition, fourth edition, and we're constantly changing the verbiage and the language. You know what, if we got a whim up our ass every time or every new generation that changed the Constitution of the United States, we'd be in a lot of fucking trouble.
Yeah.
You know? You know, depending on my whim today, you know, or my experience. When I was 20, I think a lot different now that I'm 50. You know, and why do we constantly find it necessary to change the things that work in the first place?
Evidently, I say part of our growth that we're coming about is that we recognize how addicts think. We recognize how we think. We come in here with the changing of ideas in a flip of a moment, until such time we grow to such maturity that we don't have to change every time the wind blows. But that is something that we've had to learn. It's not we had no history as to how to do those things. We've had to learn by rote, so to speak, or learn by this process of trial and error. Even to the point where you're talking about we've mandated 5 years and don't touch nothing. We had to come to that, oh, we can do that, can't we? Oh, we don't have to touch that. And then they can put that on and say, put it on for 10 years if you want to. That you don't use, if it's working, if it's politically correct, why alter it? Just because Joe walked in the door and said, well, today the sun come up differently.
There are two forces at play here, and I think what we'll eventually, I hope we'll eventually do is come to a balance between the two. We've got a need for stability. We've got a need to maintain the things that have worked in the past. That's a very, very real need. Also, it's a reality that as soon as we start discussing something, new ideas start emerging. We need to be able to reflect those. So we have these two needs, the need to maintain the stability and the historical material and what has worked, and the need to express the new ideas that have modified that. Our understanding as a fellowship of the disease of addiction is far beyond what the basic text says right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Our understanding of the disease of addiction as a fellowship, common understanding, is far beyond what the basic text says right now. How are we going to reflect that? And yet still maintain the integrity of what's worked for all of us. There's a balance in there somewhere.
So is there a limit, like whoever's working on it, like on the literature committee, it's not somebody that walks in with a year who really doesn't have the experience or the knowledge? Is there guidance for people on the literature committee to have a certain amount of, and I don't mean time, but knowledge about these experiences to keep the integrity of what the changes are?
Well, you're there. You're the protector.
The way things are in the current system, before another edition of the basic text is sent out to the fellowship for general use, it will have to be approved by 2/3 of the representatives of the Fellowship of Narcotics Anonymous. It's the fellowship that will decide whether or not we have another edition of the basic text. As long as we maintain the fellowship's voice in what happens to Narcotics Anonymous and maintain the representative system or a representative system making those basic decisions, then the fellowship will be making those decisions.
And there's a built-in guideline and protections along that. We have a call of trust now and things that have to go through the fellowship in order to become anything that's for the fellowship or the rest of the organization.
Okay, we got two hands here, and that's going to have to be it. Hey, Steve.
I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area. We noticed that the Alcohol Fellowship, they're running little spots on television with our hotline. What do you see NA doing?
We do the same thing.
The question was, he's from San Francisco, and he has noticed little television spots sponsored by Alcoholics Anonymous. What do we do in that area? We have them also.
We have them also.
They may not be run in your local community, but they are available. Pancho. If you find something like that you feel like it's important to be said in our meetings and you don't hear it being said,
Say it.
Stick your hand in the air, sucker.
You're getting the picture. Yeah.
Can we have a hand for Greg and Bob?
What else you gonna do here?
I've asked Stacy to read just for today.
I'm an addict called Stacy. Just for today. Tell yourself, just for today, my thoughts will be on my recovery, living and enjoying life without the use of drugs. Just for today, I will have faith in someone in NA who believes in me and wants to help me in my recovery. Just for today, I will have a program. I will try to follow it to the best of my ability. Just for today, through NA, I will try to get a better perspective on my life. Just for today, I will be unafraid. My thoughts will be on my new associations, people who are not using and who have found a new way of life. So long as I follow that way, I have nothing to fear. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Please help us improve our ranking so others can find us by putting a review on Stitcher, iTunes, or your favorite podcast index. Knotpot is ad-free thanks to the folks supporting the show with $1 or more per month. If you enjoy listening, you can join them by going to knotpot.xyz and looking for the donate link. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.